You're listening to The Chronomancer and the Book of Worms, Book 1 of the Destiny of the Void Triangle. Written by Jason Harrington. Narrated by Mason Hamilton. Chapter 1. The Earth remembers when everyone forgets. In the previous months, there were deep ensnaring drifts of snow that left the streets empty and silent. Families huddled indoors, seeking warmth from fire or each other. Weaker huts and hovels collapsed, casting families into the bitter cold. The already meager food stores were gone, leaving them to wonder if they would freeze or starve first. The starvation passed when the king's personal retainers were dispatched to distribute loaves of bread to the families. Now only the remains of fallen huts and the gouged earth told winter's tale. About a week ago, the rains began, gently wearing down the ice and snow, eroding the last of the bitter season. Wooden buckets were placed in the rain, collecting water that would be clean enough to drink. Now the pail and the snow were gone, and only the round depressions in the clay-like mud told of the merciful rain. Ryland was only a boy of 14 years, so it was a simple thing to forget a season's torment. He barely remembered how the generous loaves of bread were never dispersed in previous years. He forgot about cramped muscles or an aching belly. He only understood that the sun was soothingly warm on his light tan skin. It was good to let his wiry legs step so carefree in the streets. The rays of sunshine and the bustle in the streets brought a smile to his narrow face, further creating the illusion of a glow in his brilliant blue eyes. He was here to retrieve a spade and a tilling hoe for his father, and a basket of seeds for his mother. In previous years, none of these were present. The farmers always used whatever rocks and sticks would break the soil. They often carried handfuls of seeds for miles. Ryland's father told him the king won an argument against the nobles on their behalf. King Malaric would do so much more if he could. Ryland's mother added that the king only needed practical arguments that would win over the self-interests of the nobility. The outskirts, as they were called, were a series of huts and low mud hovels nestled a mile away from the edge of the capital city of Paulensor. At last, Ryland found a thick throng of villagers. They were surrounding a high-walled cart, warded by a pair of brightly colored soldiers. They held their halberds loosely as they glanced about with boredom. Between the two disinterested guards, a pair of garishly dressed merchants distributed the promised implements from the cart. Their faces displayed barely concealed contempt and disgust. The merchants' displeasure for the outskirts could not extinguish the sense of relief or joy that filled the air. This planting season would be far easier and more fruitful than any before. There was certain to be excess in the harvest. The farmers might hold greater food stores for the next winter. Men and women were crowded, patiently waiting for the new tools. Ryland was the only child in evidence, and the other farmers allowed him to move freely. They gently urged him forward, with a smile in greeting. The other children would be playing in the woods between the village and in the fields to the south, staying close enough for their parents' liking. Ryland held few similarities with boys his age. Many of them were his friends, true, but he spent much of his time helping his mother and father however he could. For now, this meant they would be able to find a patch of field and prepare it, while he fetched their implements. They wouldn't be able to do much else, but his effort allowed them to rest before their toils began. And that was enough for him. Ryland was close to the cart now. He stood still and closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the pleasant warmth of the sun soothing his scalp under his long, shining black hair. Heat gathered between his drooping patchwork shirt and pants and his stick-thin body. His skin barely concealed his bones with little bumps of muscle from labor, but that was scarcely different from any other farmer. His hide shoes were so worn and aged that he no longer felt the blisters or cuts from walking unprotected. But Ryland didn't think of these things that marked his impoverished life. It was a warm start of spring. He had eaten more today than the last 2 months, and farming was about to become easier for everyone. It felt like a very promising day to him. At last, Ryland stood before a short round man in a maroon velvet doublet and hideously tight leggings.
"Go away, urchin. I have nothing for children here,"
the man growled irritably. I am here in place of my mother and father, sir. They are making ready a patch of field. The rotund merchant rolled his brown eyes before forcibly retrieving a shovel, hoe, and basket from his cart and shoving them angrily at Ryland.
"Whatever gets you to cease wasting my time?"
he turned, grumbling with annoyance. Ryland began a measured run to the edge of the village. He resisted the impulse to close his eyes as he fast approached the cemetery to the south. The spring, the tools, and the fresh food lessened the memory of the bitter winter. The fresh shallow graves mounded at the edge of the village were a constant, painful reminder. The winter claimed 20 lives before departing. Half of them were infants too weak to withstand the hunger or the cold. Mothers and fathers often went into the harsh blizzards simply to gather rocks and dig their children's graves with cold, bleeding hands. When he was smaller, it was only a thicket of crossed wooden poles over mounds of dirt. He could no longer ignore the melancholy scent so easily now. His steps slowed slightly, and his smile faded. He wanted to think on the spring, on anything pleasant, but his memory would not yield. During the long nights of the last winter, Ryland lay close to the hearth in the hovel. He heard the moaning of the cold wind seeping through the cracks in the mud and straw. In that wind, he heard a sound that caused him to weep instantly. There was the sound of a woman wailing in the cemetery, unfazed by the cold. The sound of her tormented cries and the moaning wind were like tortured screams of the damned. The pain cut deeply into his being without mercy, as uncaring as the wind it rode in on. The tormented memory was cut abruptly short. Behind Ryland to the east, shouts and commotions filled the air. Unable to resist his growing curiosity, Ryland turned around to investigate. There was another larger crowd of villagers at the eastern edge of the outskirts. It was difficult for Ryland to see behind the thick mass of men and women bunched close. It was harder still to hear anything distinct over the angry shouts. But Ryland didn't need much more than that to understand. The villagers were generally a friendly and enduring people, helping each other and strangers in need. But a rotating shift of miners had returned from the mountains far to the eastern border of Malkinor. That alone would be enough to turn every good mood sour. Ryland could make out the large burly figures, swaying drunkenly and towering above the farming villagers. The miners were originally from the outskirts. A long time ago, they would have been greeted with cheers and open arms. It was hoped then that they would mine for greater pay than the farmers could ever dream. For a while, that's what they did. But that changed. The nobles of Malkinor believed paying a silver piece for every mined pound was too generous. To avoid losing their precious money, they established a series of taverns, gambling houses, and pleasure dens at a discreet distance from the iron mines. At first the miners held their earnings, wishing only to help their families. In time, the seduction was too great. The miners began to squander all their earnings. When a new rotation of miners arrived to take their place, forcing them to return home, they came first with the guilt and despair. As this betrayal continued with each shift, they spent money to drink away their guilt. They became drunk and useless, even when they returned home. Their guilt changed into anger, and they lashed out at friends and family alike. Life without the miners in the village was a blessing. Now the farmers simply wanted them gone. Ryland watched as one of the large figures pushed through, shoving men and women aside, moving to the other side of the street. He halted before a middle-aged woman with dark hair, sitting with her hands in her lap. She stared ahead, her bloodshot brown eyes blank, her jaw gaping open. She seemed not to notice the miner towering in front of her. Her mouth twitched as though beginning to form words that would never finish.
"Is that all you've been doing since I've been away?"
His gruff voice demanded, slurring. A faint moan escaped her, and that was when Ryland remembered that this catatonic woman was the one he heard in the late winter nights.
"Have you made a single copper piece at all from those silly dirt piles? Anything for me?"
His voice climbed angrily. She had buried their child alone, while he was away. Ryland knew this man drank and gambled, while she was left alone to her pain. She held no easy escape as he did. Ryland also knew that this miner would beat his wife unless someone intervened. A boy against a giant. Ryland dropped the tilling hook and basket and approached with a spade in his hand.